She thought she buried him the day he walked out silent, broken, discarded. 10 years later, when her world begins to burn from the inside out, she realizes too late that ghosts don't stay buried. They wait. The pen dragged across the paper with a weight that felt more like a verdict than a formality, and I didn't flinch, I didn't ask questions, I simply slid the paperwork back across the table and met her eyes just once, and that was all I needed. Then I stood, and the scrape of the chair was loud in the silence, and she smiled, not a kind smile, but one that was tight, twisted, cruel, a flicker of triumph that seared itself into my mind deeper than any goodbye. And when I stepped out and shut the door behind me, I didn't just leave a house, I walked away from the image of the man she believed could be discarded without cost, and the truck engine rumbled to life beneath me as I drove away, and she stood on the porch, arms folded, laughing, a sharp, brittle sound like glass breaking in the cold, and I drove until the streets blurred, until familiar faded into something unrecognizable in the rearview mirror, and I never turned back. 5 years, that's how long I juggled 2 jobs, worked weekends, took every shift I could just so she could chase a dream I once shared with her. Nursing school clinicals exams, and I was the one brewing coffee at midnight, holding her while she wept, telling her she was capable when she doubted everything. But in the end, I was only a rung on the ladder, and once she reached the top, she didn't hesitate to knock it over, and I vanished, changed my name, cashed out everything, and handed her the keys to a home I had poured my soul into. In the day the last deposit cleared, I erased my fears past, and I kept to myself, rebuilt from scratch in a quiet town where no one knew what I had lost, and I grew stronger, body and mind. I studied, worked, evolved. I stayed in the shadows and watched her shine online. The cars, the vacations, the shallow smiles, and designer lives a new man on her arm in just 6 months, and I said nothing. I waited. Then 10 years later, the silence broke, a no number straight to voicemail again, then again, and when I finally muted the phone, it had 169 missed calls, and I knew the sound of desperation without pressing play. Panic, regret, fear. Somehow she had found me, and that night I sat by the window with a glass of whiskey and watched the stars disappear behind clouds, and I thought about calling her back, but I didn't. Not yet. This wasn't going to be emotional. It would be clean. Seth. Next morning, I opened my laptop and started tracing her life thread by thread, and it was easier than I expected. Her new husband, a mortgage broker with questionable ethics. Their house, a grand facade. They couldn't afford her job, a reputable hospital backed by donors she kept far too close, and I took my time. 6 months of quiet tips to the IRS about shady deals, anonymous messages to her hospital board about her 2 personal TIs to certain pharmaceutical reps, a private investigator for the late night meetings that didn't end in offices, every move planned, every domino lined up. Then I acted. The hospital launched an inquiry, the IRS locked their accounts, her husband's firm cut him loose, and everything began to fall apart, not in fire but in silence, a slow unraveling, late payments, whisper, rumors, invitations never extended, and I watched until she called again, and this time I answered. At first only silence, then a breath, and her voice cracked and quiet. Please, I just need to talk to you. And I leaned back, eyes on the skyline. Talkie made a mistake, she said, voice breaking. I see that now. I was blind. I didn't know what I had. I didn't know until it was gone, and I let the silence stretch until it hurt. I miss you, she whispered. God, I miss you. Please just let me see you. And I pictured her there in the wreckage of her carefully curated life, surrounded by the ashes of every choice she'd made, and my voice was low, cold. Yeah, don't miss me. I said, you missed a man who would have carried you through this. He's gone. You killed him. A sob cracked through the speaker, raw and jagged, but it didn't reach me, couldn't, and I hung up. There was no redemption, no revival, no do-over. I stood at the window as the city lights shimmered to a blur of unshed tears, and felt only stillness, cold, final peace. And she called again and again, and I never answered, and I let her drown in the silence she once left me in, and behind me her world turned to ash, and I watched from the other side of the fire, untouched and finally free. But freedom wears many faces, and silence does not always mean peace, and it began with a letter, no return address, but I knew the handwriting, the loops, the slant, the desperate pressure of the pen. I held it for hours unopened, until curiosity overpowered restraint, and I unfolded it slowly, expecting apology, confession, plea, but what waited inside was colder than ink's gone. She wrote, he took the car, the cash, my credit is ruined, I have nothing left, they are investigating me, I don't know what you did, but I know it was you. I can feel it in every closed door and every voice that goes quiet when I walk in. I deserve it maybe, but you deserved better than me, and I can't fix that, and I won't ask you to. Please just let me see you one last time. I need To know you were real, that we were real, I need to see your eyes one more. Timmy folded it back neatly and set it on fire in the kitchen sink. The flames ate the paper greedily as if it too knew no forgiveness was coming, and I watched the last ashes curl like her carefully constructed life. Then I poured myself another drink and stared at the phone. She didn't call that night, nor the one after, but I could feel her presence in the static of unanswered messages and the sudden tension of passing days in the quiet that hung too long. Then came the envelope from the lawyer, not hers, mine. Somehow she had reached into my new life again and clawed out something I didn't think she could. My past name attached to an old joint account, reactivated. Flagged and now frozen. My employer notified I was summoned for questioning, and when I stepped into the bank office, the manager slid over photos, grainy but unmistakable, me and her from years ago, smiling, holding hands, signing papers, and my pulse spiked. She had kept everything, every trace, every link, every document, while I had burned, erased, disappeared. She had prepared for this moment like a shadow sleeper ready to awaken and destroy, and I walked out stunned, the world tilting, not from guilt, but from the terrifying realization she had never let go. She had waited and watched just as I had, but her game wasn't retribution, it was resurrection. The next night, I returned to my apartment to find the door ajar and my breath stilled. I stepped in, and nothing was taken, nothing was broken, only a single photo placed on my table of us from long ago in the park where I first told her I loved her, and on the back in her scrawl, I remember everything. My stomach turned, my heart didn't ache, it thudded, slow, heavy, controlled. I knew what I had to do. I booked a flight back to the city I swore I'd never set foot in again, and rented a car and drove past the streets of our old life until I found the place she now lived. Once grand faded, a haunted echo of ambition turned to desperation. She opened the door before I knocked, eyes hollow, lips trembling, and for a moment, just one moment, I saw the girl I had once sacrificed everything for, and she stepped aside without a word, and I entered the ruins of what she had built, and we sat across from each other, silence between as deeper than words, and she said, I'm dying. The words landed not like a weapon but a whisper, and she showed me the papers, the scans, the treatments she couldn't afford, and I looked into her eyes and saw not the monster who laughed as I left, but the woman who had lost more than she ever admitted. And I didn't speak. I stood and walked to the window and stared at the street below. She asked, do you hate me? And I said, no, hate needs energy, and you drained that from me long ago. I said, I don't pity you either. I said, what I feel isn't something you get to know. She nodded slowly, tears gathering but not falling, and I walked past her and she didn't try to stop me, and when I reached the door she whispered, I never stopped loving you, and I paused, hand on the knob, and turned just enough to say, you only loved what I gave, not who I was. And I stepped out into the cool evening air, free again, but this time not from her, from the weight of it all, the revenge, the silence, the obsession. I drove away, not looking back, not out of spite, but because I no longer needed. Tosh never called again, and I never wondered why in the end. The past wasn't a chain, it was a choice, and I chose to let it burn completely. And when the stars returned to the night sky, they shimmered not with memory but with promise, emerald, and life lesson. True strength is not in revenge but in reclaiming your identity after betrayal. Love that demands sacrifice without respect is not love, it is dependency in disguise. Healing begins not when we retaliate but when we walk away without needing closure. Sometimes, letting go isn't weakness, it's the most powerful form of freedom. In the end, the past only owns you if you choose to carry it.